Hi, I'm Thomas Pfeiffer of Thomas Pfeiffer and Partners in New York, and you're listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. On this special edition of US Modernist Radio, taped live earlier this year at the Onera Foundation in New Canaan, Connecticut, we explored diplomacy through modernist architecture with three guests. Dublin architect Cormac Murray gives a talk on John Johansen's U.S. Embassy in Dublin. That's then followed by a panel discussion with George and Cormac and legendary photographer Norman McGrath, who shot that building soon after it opened, and architect Christen Johansen, son of John Johansen, who discusses family legacy. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by the Brent R. Harris Charitable Trust, restorer of Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House in Palm Springs and 6 other houses in California, by the E. Fay Jones Conservancy, preserving the legacy of modernist architecture in Northwest Arkansas, efayjonesconservancy.org, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And now, here's your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. The Onera Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of historic American architecture, and it was founded in 2018 by David Peterson. The foundation opened its beautifully restored building to the public in 2025 in New Canaan, and it advocates for preservation through funding exhibitions and innovative programming. The foundation also sponsors the $25,000 Onera Prize at Columbia for graduate students in historic preservation. Let's go now to New Canaan, Connecticut, where Onera Foundation Executive Director Laurence Laforgue introduces the evening event.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight and for braving this dreadful weather. Really appreciate your company. I'm Laurence Laforgue, the Executive Director of the Onera Foundation. Our mission here at the Onera Foundation is to advocate for preservation of significant American architecture by funding scholarly research, art and architecture exhibitions, and public programs that make preservation relevant and accessible to a broader audience. This season at 63 Park Street, we are focused on Cold War-era U.S. embassies, a subject that Onera Foundation founder and president David Peterson, who's with us tonight, knows very well about and has written extensively about. His book is available here in our gallery space, if you'd like to know more. The U.S. embassies of the Cold War were State Department-commissioned buildings that expressed America's democratic ideals through architecture. Many of these buildings are now being decommissioned, including the U.S. Embassy in Oslo, which is the subject of the exhibition by Jorge Otero Pylos, currently on display in our galleries. The Dublin Embassy, designed by John Johansen, is another structure slated for imminent decommissioning. It is exhibited upstairs and will be the subject of tonight's talk. As its future enters a new chapter, it is especially important to understand its past, and tonight's speakers are uniquely positioned to guide us. Our program will include a 30-minute book presentation by Cormac Murray, followed by a 30-minute conversation amongst our panelists. Allow me first to introduce Cormac. Cormac Murray is an Irish architect, writer, and lecturer at the School of Architecture, Building and the Environment at TU Dublin. He also serves on the ICOMOS Ireland National Scientific Committee on 20th Century Heritage, and he will present tonight his new released book titled America at Home, The Architecture and Politics of the U.S. Embassy in Dublin. His research journey on the John Johansen 1964 U.S. Embassy building began when an essay he wrote on its concrete construction was shortlisted for the Drawing Matter Writing Prize in 2021. Cormac has given a number of public tours of the building as part of the Open House Dublin Festival, and he was later awarded an Agility Award by the Arts Council of Ireland to support his ongoing research into the building. Before we begin this program, I want to acknowledge that we have the privilege of welcoming John Johansen's children tonight. Deborah Harris Johansen, who is here in the audience, and Christen Johansen, who will join our panel discussion later on. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate it. And now, please join me in welcoming Cormac Murray.
Thank you so much. I wrote this book as a story of a love affair with a building and a fascination with its architect. Having spent a number of years researching Irish modern architecture, I started looking at this building with a belief that there was no equivalent building to this in Dublin, and I soon learned that there are few equivalent buildings to this anywhere. Today I'll take you on a very condensed tour of the building's background, design, construction to its opening in 1964. The book is called America at Home, The Architecture and Politics of the US Embassy in Dublin, and I'll return to the title later. The book was designed by Eamon Hall of Art Department Studio in Dublin and published by the Phibsborough Press. And just to touch on the design of the book, it takes its inspiration from manuals and folios of the era. It has a silver textured cover and thin transparent pages with predominantly black and white images. It strives to be an object that communicates not just with words and images, but a kind of body language of design, as we put it. So I've made a decision to refer to this exclusively as the US Embassy. It is in fact the Chancery of the Embassy of the United States because there's no ambassador's residence in it. It's a squat 4-story building, and it presents as 3 stories over basement on one side to a plaza and 4 to the rear where the car park is located. What's most notable about it is that it's circular and it's in exposed precast concrete. The structural precast concrete facade is made up of these striking twisted fins which have been compared to everything from whale jawbones to Celtic tracery to Aran sweater patterns. And when it opened, it was a white cylindrical form set behind this plaza with 2 main entrances. The plaza was publicly accessible and described as a gift to the people of Dublin. Today, for obvious reasons, it's heavily secured behind steel railings. And just to briefly give you an idea, here's a very simple section and a first floor plan of the building. It's effectively a hollow cylinder. The inner portion contains a top-lit 3-story atrium, which is supported by those 3 kidney bean-shaped circulation cores. The offices are then in rings around the atrium with a circular corridor gallery looking down into the event space at each level. The context of when this building was built was a period after World War II when the United States was attempting to spread its global influence by having an expanded diplomatic presence in strategic countries. New embassies and chanceries were being built, existing buildings were renovated and extended. The overriding agenda from a foreign policy point of view was to counter the potential spread of communism. The Office of Foreign Building Operations, FBO, was established within the US State Department to create buildings that symbolized the perceived values of the US government and allegedly its people. At the time, the United States Information Agency or Service built what were effectively cultural centers to promote American design, art, and literature. Often these buildings were housed in the same complex, as was the case in Dublin. So this wonderful map from Time magazine in 1960 shows the global ambition of these embassies and chanceries being built all across the world, with Washington as a nerve center. Most embassy locations had clear strategic significance to the US, and Dublin was an outlier in that sense. It was not significantly threatened by communism, nor did it occupy a strategic geopolitical border or hold a particular international status. Aside from Ireland being a useful refueling stop across the Atlantic, its real significance was symbolic, rooted in the influence of Irish-American voters and ultimately the Irish-American political class. The FBO's 1954 architecture policy required US overseas buildings to be distinguished, to reflect well on the United States, and to foster goodwill through architecture appropriate to each host country. And rather than reinforcing a single style of architecture, the policy emphasized creating positive relations through high-quality buildings that responded to the architecture of their host country. This policy was developed after a period of political scrutiny and was aimed to shield the State Department from partisan influence over architectural style and spending, establishing clear principles for federal buildings abroad. And it mandated that embassy architecture express perceived American values while also responding to the local, cultural, and environmental contexts. During the 1950s, leading modernist architects, many of them European émigrés, were commissioned to design technologically advanced, inviting embassies that contrasted sharply with classical architecture, which had become associated with communist and totalitarian regimes. These were not like any embassies before or since. And some examples that we have here, on the top left, you have the Chancery in Athens by Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus and the Architects Collaborative. It used Pentelic marble cladding and was inspired by the Parthenon. To the right, you have one-time New Canaan resident Marcel Breuer's embassy in The Hague. It used a repeated hexagonal motif in travertine and concrete, and it's now a wonderful art gallery. Below, you have Edward Durrell Stone's embassy in New Delhi, which took inspiration from the Taj Mahal and is one of the most feted embassies of this period. And really briefly, it's just worth outlining the process for funding because it's crucial to this story. So typically, the Architects Advisory Panel of the FBO selected and appointed an architect to design an embassy. The architect presented designs to the panel, and once the panel had approved the designs, government funds for site acquisition, appointments, and construction were approved by Congress. So what I'm saying is Congress controlled the purse strings. And the advisory panel itself was a rotating committee of civil servants and architects, originally headed by Pietro Bellusci, Henry Shepley, and Ralph Walker. It later included Eero Saarinen. And during this period, the State Department used post-war foreign credits to finance most of its overseas construction, which were effectively non-tax dollars. These funds were generated by land settlements, sale of surplus property, or asset agreements and economic cooperation funds. The construction of the Dublin Embassy, for example, was partly financed by the sale of properties in Antwerp and Paris. So here we have an image of Senator Wayne Hayes speaking at the opening of the embassy in Dublin in May of 1964. And it's remarkable to me that he was given the honour to open the building, praising it in his speech as one of the finest buildings in Europe and comparing John Johansen to one of the great Irish poets, when 5 years prior he had said the design was likely to ruin Irish-American relations. I'll have more on that later. The event had dignitaries, the Irish president, business people, and was by most reports a serious affair. But I think I enjoy John Johansen's description of it the most: a free whiskey party for some 300 tipsy Dubliners. So I think when listening to interviews with John, reading his writing or poetry, or even studying his architecture, I kept finding examples of this recurring wit or playfulness, which is, I can say, is very refreshing in the serious world of mid-century modern architecture. So this wonderful photograph taken by Norman McGrath here shows John Johansen at the embassy opening. In my words, Johansen was a maverick architect. He was educated in the Harvard Graduate School of Design under Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer. Amongst his many talents, he was a painter, sculptor, composer, poet, and theorist. He was born in New York in 1916 to a couple of celebrated portrait artists, and he received national fame as a member of the Harvard Five here in New Canaan, as you know. And what's very interesting is that after the US Embassy, Johansen became more interested in spray-form concrete, circuitry-inspired architecture, kinetic architecture, and later nano-architecture. So he really was a creative person, individual. I love this description by Quid Nunc, that's a pen name, in the Irish Times, the Irish paper of record, at the opening, which described Johansen as shy and nervous as a first-time parent, while accepting congratulations on his unique design, which would mellow down with happy harmony with its surroundings. And when you read that, you realise it's a backhanded compliment. And also a sad irony, because what we've learned is that he was described as father-like the day after he learned of the passing of his own father, Christen Johansen, upon arriving in Ireland. So when did John Johansen first come to Dublin? The embassy story actually links back to an influential 1950 exhibition built in USA, post-war architecture, a travelling exhibition from the Museum of Modern Art, which was co-funded by the United States Information Service. It was effectively a part of that Cold War cultural diplomacy. It visited the Hugh Lane Gallery, which you see an image of here in Dublin in 1950. And included in that exhibition was Johansen's own house here in New Canaan, the Upside Down House, which unfortunately no longer exists. And whether or not this particular project was noticed by officials in Dublin is not clear, but it certainly helped cement Johansen's international reputation in the 1950s as a rising star in the American scene. For example, Peter Blake, the editor of Architectural Forum, had rated him in the top 3 most creative architects practicing in America in 1958, I think just behind Louis Kahn and Mies van der Rohe. His later projects, which I'm sure many of you know, such as the Warner House, the Villa Ponte here in New Canaan, enhanced this reputation further, marking a break from strict functionalist modernism towards more playful architecture with historical references, symmetry, and experimental structures and materials. He himself describes this as his neoclassical period. So in an interview, John later recalled his appointment for Dublin. He said, "I was called to Washington and given this commission. I said, I don't know I was qualified, and the architects there said, you've designed some very fine houses. We think you can design an embassy in Dublin. Will you accept the commission?" He was one of the youngest architects in the entire US Embassy program, appointed at the age of 40, with relatively little prior experience in large-scale corporate projects. Some historians point to this as ultimately leading to issues with the design. However, I like to point out that architectural greats like Paul Rudolph and Louis Kahn couldn't even get their designs approved by the panel. This building took shape at a pivotal point in Dublin's evolution from the city's past as a stronghold of the British Empire to its rebirth as a capital of independent Ireland, albeit an economically restricted one. And then finally, in the late 20th century, its emergence as an outward-facing global city. Dublin had blossomed in the 18th century as a grand Georgian capital under British rule, but after the Act of Union in 1801 shifted political power out of Dublin and back to London, it entered a slow, long decline marked by economic stagnation and deteriorating inner-city housing. Through the 19th century, poverty and overcrowded tenements persisted and the city's growth slowed. After the Irish Free State was established in 1922, it once again served as a national capital, though still facing limited industrial development. By the mid-20th century, its historic core remained worn, while suburban expansion accelerated. To give you context, Dublin's population was around 700,000 by the mid-1960s in a country of 2.8 million. A slightly later aerial photograph shows Dublin as a smoke-filled city of distilleries, stained civic buildings, and imperial remnants, modernising slowly. Its skyline is relatively low-rise, but choked by fumes from traffic exhaust, coal boilers, and turf fires, a fact that Johansen actually noticed, and I'll get to that. In the mid to late 20th century, all of this was occurring amid high levels of emigration to the US and with efforts from the Irish state to attract American trade and investment. The visit of John F. Kennedy, the first Irish-American Catholic president in June of 1963, was transformative for Irish society. As writer Colm Tóibín wrote, it was the moment Ireland woke up. He described how the notion that Americans come in technicolor were all part of the Irish dream. It coincided with the arrival of television in Ireland in 1961, further heightening the sense of change, excitement, and possibility. So come back to that term, the changing face of Dublin. This accompanying image, almost science fiction-like, shows one of the embassy's floor plates being lowered into place with silhouetted workers below. While it predated it by 5 years, it is eerily reminiscent for me of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, the black monolith arriving and changing a civilization forever. The suburb of Ballsbridge, where the embassy was located, was and is an affluent part of Dublin City, developed by the Earls of Pembroke between 1863 and 1900. In 1957, John J. Rooney, an Irish-American politician, created a public relations nightmare for the US Embassy, describing the area as a slum. The lasting influence of Rooney's comments were evident when the visiting delegation were asked about them 6 years later, arriving in Shannon Airport en route to the embassy opening. The embassy site was originally a Victorian house, which the State Department purchased in 1953 and demolished in 1956. This image from 1913 shows the future embassy site as a heavily wooded corner between 2 Victorian terraces, an awkward triangular site that presented a real challenge, a design challenge for Johansen. And this is just a timeline illustrating the 7.5 years that John Johansen worked on this project. He was appointed in late 1956, and we know he produced at least 7 formal design iterations of the scheme, and likely many more studies that never were presented to the review panel. He presented his first design in 1957, and it was a rectangular building that used extensive glass with a small courtyard at the centre. It was poorly received by the panel of architects. His second version, a month later, prompted director William Hughes to accuse him of copying the modernistic bus terminal that was recently built in Dublin. Struggling to find the right form for a triangular site, he moved on to a hexagonal 2-story building, and then a year later came up with a 3-story hexagonal scheme, which we have some images of. And after his 4th rejection by the panel, he was then invited to resign or continue from scratch, and he chose to continue. When he came to a circular design, it finally received approval from the panel, only for the process then to be stalled by a further 2 years until the intervention of John F. Kennedy. This model here has some of the landscaping features, and there's motifs here that were sort of carried through into the final circular design as well. So the arrival of Eero Saarinen in the Architects Advisory Panel in 1957 was critical to the process. Johansen was reluctant to let go from this hexagonal design, and he explained in an interview to Irish writer Shane O'Toole, "In the midst of my confusion, Eero Saarinen, who designed the American Embassy in London, put his arm around me like an older brother and said, 'You think this is the best building you're ever going to do. You think this is the big commission. It's not. I thought it was so huge and important that it stood in the way of my creative process.'" Which is very honest and interesting. So the review panel encouraged Johansen to lose himself in the red brick of Dublin, leading to these hybrid brick and concrete studies. He then started to move on to more organic fluid forms in concrete that start to resemble the final circular design. Johansen was able to present a robust argument for a circular shape, saying that it represented unity and critically addressed in all directions, turning its back on no one. So after the final selection by the Architectural Committee, the design was published in Ireland in August of 1958, almost as a fait accompli, with this illustration here by Helmut Jacobi, and was widely praised in the Irish press. Johansen returned to the drawing board and produced an even more intricate version with a double twisted concrete fin. And some of these perspectives that John Johansen produced in this period, they're extraordinary and deeply atmospheric and evocative of the building as it's experienced today. Shane O'Toole, the Irish writer, wrote in the foreword to my book that they are evocative, revealing another reality, one full of shade and men shifting in the shadows of the rotunda, always watching. Le Carré often wondered who was watching the watchers, madmen and cold concrete. And Shane likes to point out that when he says madmen, he means mutually assured destruction, not Don Draper. So the scheme was published in Architectural Forum in 1958 with the headline, "For Éire," which is the Gaelic word for Ireland, "a new Celtic tower." It was at this point, when everything seemed to be going swimmingly, that Congress first got sight of the scheme. By then, the foreign credits had been largely used up, so they'd be relying on government funds. Resistance was led by Democrat Wayne Hayes of Ohio, who dramatically claimed the building would be completely out of place and that it could even destroy Irish-American diplomatic relations. Hayes likened it to a modernistic mausoleum, saying that the thing looks as much as a Celtic tower as I do a jet airplane. A Democrat colleague described it as a series of flapjacks with a pat of butter on top. The director of the FBO was fired, a new policy was drawn up, and the whole future of the programme was in doubt. So in 1959, a kind of obituary was published in Architectural Forum, which stated that John Johansen's proposed Celtic tower design for the US Embassy in Dublin has been killed. So the project stalled politically until the US ambassador to Ireland in 1961, a close friend of President Kennedy, wrote to him, calling the deadlock situation nothing short of disgraceful. He praised Johansen's collaboration with Irish architect Michael Scott, noting that the plans had been thoroughly reviewed and widely supported in Ireland. So after further exchanges between the State Department and political opponents, Kennedy wrote directly to Wayne Hayes, stating, "While I agree the design will not please all tastes, the delay and expense involved in redesigning the building indicate that we should go ahead with the present design." This was enough to secure approval. And it may have helped that John Johansen was a contemporary of Kennedy in Choate and later Harvard. Gropius and the Architects Collaborative began the Athens Embassy in 1956, presented two options for approval, and it opened in 1961. Brewer presented a single approved design in 1956, one and done, and then The Hague opened in 1959. Johansen, meanwhile, produced at least 7 formal iterations, and the Dublin Embassy opened 8 years later in 1964. And these are some of John's beautiful construction drawings. It indicates the grain of concrete texture and implies how gradations of light will hit the sensuous curves. For me, this represents the overlap of architecture in its purest sense, where the scientific, which is dimensions, materials, proportions, meets the artistic, texture, atmosphere, and shading. And the texture had another meaning. Johansen was imagining a future where car exhaust fumes would blacken the concrete, just as the limestone and Portland stone of significant civic buildings in Dublin were at the time masked by soot. He was trying to anticipate and take ownership of the weathering, a similar objective to Eero Saarinen in London. So I'm not sure if Karen Santry is here tonight, but I was fortunate to correspond with Karen, who's the daughter of George Santry of Shock Beton, who introduced the Dutch concrete fabrication system to the US, and he moved from Europe to New Canaan at the encouragement of Philip Johnson. Shock Beton fabricated the concrete you see here for Johnson's Pavilion in the Pond, a precursor study to his David Koch Theatre at the Lincoln Center. And Shock Beton was also favoured by Marcel Breuer on a number of his American and European projects, hence Johansen's awareness of this particular system. What was a wonderful discovery for me was that Shock Beton were so proud of their work on the Dublin Embassy that briefly in the 1970s they incorporated the building's twisted fin into their American logo, giving it the S shape. And I love imagining how the embassy's influence quietly spread across North America, appearing on corporate stamps and drawings far from Dublin. So I was extremely lucky during the making of this book to receive some original photographs taken in the Shock Beton factory in Kampen in the Netherlands. Shock Beton literally means shocked concrete, and it was developed in the Netherlands in the early 1930s. It pioneered a patented method of vertically shocking a stiff concrete mix in moulds to produce an exceptionally dense, durable, and finely detailed precast concrete. It was founded in 1932, and the company's technique enabled thin, high-quality architectural panels to be manufactured quickly and consistently. This was a time in the 1950s and 60s where there was a widespread precast concrete mania. Construction favoured precast due to labour shortages, steel inflation, and its technical potential for pre-stressing and off-site precision. Shock Beton greatly expanded also when it was used during the war for military bases, housing, and watchtowers. Many of the precasting skills were actually developed through the production of bunkers during the war. So in Johansen's drawings, he produced 9 plan sections along intervals of the twisted fin module. Then Shock Beton actually built this timber armature as a positive model of the ultimate concrete fin. It was built in obeche and plywood. Then they lapped plywood strips along this framework to get a smooth, continuous form. What I learned from doing this book that it's actually so hard to describe the complicated geometry that's happening here. It's sort of moving in 3 dimensions. And then the plywood was varnished and waxed, and then they actually manually did a 1/2 inch thickness of fiberglass on it. So what I love is the first few steps are so technically precise, and then you have this crude manual process where someone just paints it on. Each fiberglass mould was anchored to a steel frame for rigidity. And Shock Beton actually used former cabinet makers with tongue and groove jointing, so there was a real sort of craftsmanship in the process. A dense network of steel reinforcement is placed within the mould for casting. So this was the advantage of Shock Beton. They could actually use very little water in their concrete mix, and when it was vibrated, all the air could be expelled from that mix. So that meant that you could have much finer, tighter concrete details that you would sort of associate more with timber than with mass concrete. So the moulds were placed on a vibration bed, and they were vibrated up and down 1/4 inch, 250 times per minute. And one of these fins took 45 minutes as the concrete was kind of cast into the mould as it was vibrated. The finish was manually bush hammered again with an aggregate of reconstituted granite and white cement, so kind of part of that material palette of Dublin's architecture. And the real ingenious aspect of the US Embassy in Dublin's design was that the exterior and interior of the building structure could be recreated in simply 4 repeated concrete moulds. And if you look at any precast concrete building, where they tend to struggle is the corner detail, where they'll have to make a special module to actually turn the corner in 2 dimensions. But actually in this case, they could complete the entire circle without ever having to meet a corner. You had 22,000-pound wedge-shaped floor panels with a dense array of steel reinforcement making up the floor plates. And then the building was essentially flat-packed on a barge and shipped from Rotterdam to Dublin in 1,600 pieces, like a massive piece of IKEA furniture. So the pieces arrived in Dublin port, where they were moved from the quays to the embassy site, and each concrete piece was allegedly fitted into place in 30 minutes. The Irish Times described it as the nearest that automation has come to the building industry in Dublin. But the tolerance levels were off the charts. If each precast unit was oversized by 3 millimetres, that would result in a net error of 1 metre per floor, because it's in a circle. I was also very lucky to get access to these images by British photographer Anthony Kirsting, who was invited to the US Embassy when it was a construction site in 1963. We love this image of the interior atrium under construction. You can see the concrete form and this dense forest of scaffolding. And then some of the photographs of the interiors, you can see that actually the outer facade of the building alternated between these inset fixed glass windows and then also small balconies with French doors that you could open out onto. It was ingenious in the sense that all the load-bearing structure was on the outside and inside of this building. So it opens up a range of possibilities for what you can do on the kind of wheel-shaped office space, because they don't actually have to have load-bearing structure. It was one of the first buildings of its kind at the time. The Irish Times reported during its construction that it is attracting widespread attention from architects in Britain, and hardly a week passes without some visitor asking to be shown over the structure. American architects who are interested in the design think nothing of flying the Atlantic to see how it looks now that it is coming up to completion. The scaffolding had to be made in short 12-foot lengths to allow to follow the building's curve, and it was a real challenge for the contractors, G&T Crampton, who nicknamed the site the Wall of Death. And I'm hoping that's not to do with any health hazards, but actually named after the carnival ride. So here you have an aerial photograph of the building fully assembled. It's a beautiful concrete carousel sitting on the corner. Interestingly, across the road, they were building the Intercontinental Hotel, at the time Ireland's largest hotel, with William Tabler of New York, and the same executive architects of Scott Tell & Walker in Ireland, and the same builders of G&T Crampton. It started after the embassy and finished before it, which gives you an idea of the complexity. And it's also been demolished and actually will be the site of the future US Embassy when they leave Johansen's building. So they didn't go far. The building had a 9-foot moat surrounding it, fronting onto a plaza, and that was traversed via footbridge. What I love about this image, you can see the rusticated base in stone. It's very close to actually the finishing you get on one of those Martello towers, which were influencing design. What I love about that is it combines the skill and craftsmanship of modern construction on top with the traditional methods below. This building forced a modernisation of construction in Ireland that we went on to benefit then, long after John Johansen had left us. And it's just been wonderful. I'm getting it tonight, but doing a book like this and getting personal stories is what it's all about for me. So Johansen spoke of Celtic tracery and the Book of Kells as his influences. And you can actually see a similar geometric richness in the terrazzo floor of the atrium, which is now, unfortunately, mainly covered by carpet for acoustic reasons. It's quite a hard space. But the atrium is a really incredible space to be in. I think I have some more photos of it. And here we have the ambassador's office. So you can see that there were fiberglass curtains imported from America and perforated perspex ceiling above. The original furniture, I believe, was the steel case coordinated office, which was shipped in from America as well. And a point to note is, although externally comparisons were made to defensive buildings and fortifications, most of the comments from staff who originally worked here was that they could not believe how open the building was. It was 360 degrees of predominantly glass. Considering they moved there from a Georgian building, that's quite the change. And the central space, as I mentioned, became a lobby, a lounge, a performance space, and a gallery. To quote Johansen, the building turns its back on no one. And I've noticed when you're in this space with the galleries above, there's just so many vantage points, you're not sure who is looking at you from where. And originally, when it first opened, there was this beautiful telescopic transparency between the red brick surroundings of Ball's Bridge and the inner atrium. Of course, this has now been lost through later security additions. You had clear story lighting that would then move around the space from the top-lit atrium like a sundial. Every moment the public spent in one of these buildings was an intentionally curated one. It was championing a sophistication of America to nations overseas. Here's a detail of the beautiful bronze eagle, which was cast by German-Irish artist Werner Schurmann to designs by John Johansen. And I also love this photograph because it shows the sort of duality of this building. We see someone signing up in one of the embassy offices in the 1970s. You have the sleek perspex ceiling and fiberglass curtains, and on the wall hangs a poster of cowboys with USA. To Irish people, the embassy building represented both an imagined place of luxury, wealth and advancement and an imagined frontier of opportunity and optimism. You see that through the sleek furnishings, the unique modern structure, but then also a poster of cowboys as a representation of American popular culture in Ireland. So to kind of sum up, I'll come back to the book title then, America at Home. And it borrows from an expression commonly used 2 generations ago, although less so today. I have a quote here from an Irish writer of Fintan O'Toole's biography. When my mother-in-law was happy, she used a phrase she had learned in her childhood in rural Ireland in the 1930s. If you'd served her a nice dinner, for example, and asked her how everything was, she would sigh contentedly and say, "Asher, it's America at home." It was the Irish ideal of perfection, to have the pleasures and promises of America without having to emigrate. So you can imagine my surprise and delight when I was researching John Johansen, and I came across his spray-form concrete pavilion for the US at the 1956 Zagreb Trade Fair, then a communist country. It was his first collaboration with the State Department, the Department of Commerce, and the United States Information Service. So it featured this spray-form concrete pavilion in a kind of a blob shape, which was another technology that Johansen was developing. And it featured an exhibition inside entitled America at Home, where a steelworker, Ed Barnes, is the central figure. The fairgrower is supposed to get a rounded picture of a happy, contented Ed Barnes at work, at play, shopping, and his do-it-yourself workshop. So I feel like if this was maybe an audition for him working for the State Department, and I remember coming across this when I was kind of on the fence about what to call the book, but it was almost felt like John telling me, you need to go to America Home, so we're quite happy with it now. I suppose when John's obituary was published in the New York Times in October 2012, it lists his influence in modern housing in New Canaan and further afield, and a number of his splendid public buildings, but it doesn't actually mention the US Embassy building in Dublin. However, in 2018, the US Embassy was included in the Secretary of State's Register of Culturally Significant Property. This register lists diplomatic architecture and property overseas that figure prominently in America's international heritage. And what's notable about this is it's one of a handful of post-war modern buildings on that list. And while the propaganda efforts of promoting an idea about America in the building are one thing, I like to think about the quiet influence it has had on a generation of Irish architects, including myself. Others who have gone on to win the Pritzker Prize, RIBA Gold Medal and Sterling Prize, with buildings all around the world, often using precast concrete. John Johansen's gift for Dublin was Ireland's first structural precast building, one of its only circular modern buildings, and its arrival also heralded the transformation of Irish society in the 20th century. I've summed up my book by saying that it's a building that is more than the sum of its 1,600 precast concrete parts. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite our panelists to come and join Cormac. We have with us George Smart, Norman McGrath, and Christen Johansen for what promises to be a lively panel discussion, moderated by George Smart, who many of you know from the USModernist radio. So I'll make a brief introduction and then let you have at it. George Smart is the founder and CEO of USModernist, a nonprofit organization dedicated to documenting, preserving, and promoting modernist residential architecture in the United States. And he comes all the way from North Carolina today. Thank you, George. He's a longtime advocate for modernist design and has produced extensive public programming, interviews, and archives focused on architects and buildings of the post-war period. With him and to his left is Norman McGrath. No need introduction, I think, Norman. You are a most eminent architectural photographer. You spent half a century documenting modernist and postmodern architecture with, as noted in a New York Times article, and I quote, "the exacting eye of the structural engineer he was trained to be at Trinity College, Dublin." Norman is the author of several publications on architectural photography and the subject of several exhibitions. His body of work includes some of the most remarkable photographs taken of the US Embassy in Dublin, which Cormac shared, and he's also well known for his photograph documenting the demolition of Penn Station. And finally, we have the privilege of having Christen Johansen with us, who is an architect based in New York and who has collaborated with his late father on various projects, including renovation and addition. And I very much look forward to hearing more about that today. With that, please join me in welcoming our panelist and moderator. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be with Norman. We almost didn't invite him because of his youth and inexperience. But he's on the panel tonight, and I can't wait to talk to him. My first question is for Cormac. So these 1,600 precast panels, it was really IKEA before its time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did this affect other buildings in Dublin? Did they pick that up right after that? Are there other buildings we should know about that were shaped by this first one?
I think absolutely it had a very strong influence on a lot of buildings in Dublin, even one that's actually very close to the US Embassy, which is known as Texaco House, because the Texaco Oil Company used to have their headquarters there. I don't think any were as advanced or complicated or intricate as the US Embassy in Dublin, but was really interesting parallels when someone went to develop and demolish the building just adjacent to a Texaco house. They said, oh, it's just a poor man's US Embassy. But luckily they were able to demonstrate that there was different things going on there. I suppose the big difference for this is that we just couldn't make concrete like this in Dublin, so it would always have to be imported. So it would have to be for a really significant project like the US Embassy if it was to repeat. But that's not to say there was not a lot of really interesting buildings to see there, you know.
And when the building opened, this was a national event.
Yeah.
I mean, this was big news in all of Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first person to walk into it was the President of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, himself an American citizen as well. He was born in New York, which was really prestigious. And I actually have noticed as well, seeing how it's so close to Kennedy's visit to Dublin the previous year, a lot of the same faces that would have actually met with President Kennedy were there, photographed again at the opening of the US Embassy. So it was a very prestigious affair, yeah.
Now, Christen, your father was part of the legendary Harvard Five, alongside Philip Johnson, Marcel Breuer, Landis Goris, and Elliot Noyes. How did he see himself within that circle?
I think very much that it was a matter of colleagues working in the same field, but I think above that were the friendships. I think there was a great deal of camaraderie and friendship, not only between the individuals, but that went right through to the families themselves. We certainly knew the Breuer family and visited Philip Johnson as a neighbor, and it was a very easygoing sort of relationship. And I think that's rather remarkable. They were not competitive. They were very much complementary and worked here to further their own work and to further modernism.
And you used to hang out with the Breuers on Cape Cod?
We did. We would visit them, and they were in Wellfleet. We were usually in Truro, but certainly we would visit them in the ponds in Wellfleet. It was a wonderful house. They were wonderfully warm people. It was delightful.
Now, Norman, you left Trinity College, Dublin, in Ireland in 1956. You're trained as an engineer, and you have become certainly one of America's foremost architectural photographers. How did that engineering background shape how you went into photography?
Well, I'm not sure that it did actually influence me that much. I have always been a reluctant engineer. And I say that because my father was an architect, and all my interest in the subject of architecture came through him. And had my schooling been a little different, I might have gone someplace other than Trinity College, Dublin. But growing up in Dublin, as a non-Catholic in particular, my schooling was directed towards Trinity College, Dublin. But the problem with Trinity College, Dublin is it has no school of architecture. It has all the other schools, but it does not have a school of architecture. And my father felt that if I was going to study architecture, it had to be at a good school. And he was not terribly enthusiastic about schools in Ireland at that time. I don't know whether this was correct or not, but in any event, Trinity College was certainly a fine institution, and it had, in fact, a very old school of engineering. And I felt that as a structural engineer, that is something somewhat akin to architecture. In other words, the structural engineer plays a very vital role in making buildings stand up, and that's pretty important. So I decided I would compromise and I would study structural engineering rather than architecture. I didn't make that choice initially. In fact, I was in Trinity for maybe a year or so before I decided to transfer into that school, because I decided, that the other courses that I was following at that time were not going to lead to anything in particular, and I felt that I really should be more focused. So that's why I switched to engineering. But I don't think it influenced my photography very much.
Now, as you can see from these wonderful photos of the building, you could just drive right up to it, right? Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which is not how it is today, where current embassy designs are fortresses. So in your research, how did that change over time? When did it become more important to make an embassy a fortress, particularly for the United States?
What's really interesting, actually, when you look at the building opening in 1964, was that there was a last-minute push to actually say, wait, maybe we should put some fences around this, and it was the ambassador at the time who said, no, this idea of the plaza is a gift to the people of Dublin. They were very keen to actually make that open. And it led to some confusion that people believed that if you were pregnant and you decided to go to the plaza in front of the US Embassy, that your child might be a US citizen because you were technically on American soil. To the point where the US State Department actually had to make a statement and say, no, this is not the case. I don't know if it was tested anywhere, hopefully not. But yeah, I think there was a series of terrorist attacks overseas in the late 20th century, and gradually they started to introduce, in Dublin's case, they started to close it off bit by bit. And there were actually, resistance to that protest. When people get something like a public space, they're very reluctant to give it back. So now it's just the reality of any embassy in the world is that you can't expect to be able to walk up to the front door. But it's why there's real hope that if the building is vacated, that we will get a chance to actually enjoy it and appreciate it much closer up when it doesn't have the security.
Open back up again.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, this is a question for all our panelists. The embassy here was part of a deliberate United States Cold War strategy to project American values through architecture. This was the same program that produced Saarinen London embassy and, of course, Breuer's in The Hague. We don't really do that anymore. So has the United States abandoned architecture as a tool of diplomacy? You want to start, Christen?
I know that the security aspects are paramount. I worked for years with Polshek Partnership, Eniad Architects, and they did a couple of embassies while I was there. And I heard that it's apparent that the bollards and the reinforcement and everything in the glass is all bomb-proof, and it is the first layer that you look at in terms of how am I going to get some architecture out of this. It's difficult. It's formidable. I think it is then the strength of the architect to be able to create something that is delightful out of that, and it's tough. I think it was easier, obviously, in 50s and 60s, regardless of how long it took a commission to come to life. But I think now it's hard to find delight in diplomatic architecture, especially American.
Norman?
I think that one thing that one has to realize is that modern architecture at the time that the American embassy was built was really in its infancy in Dublin. There were really only a handful of significant modern buildings there. I, during one of my summer breaks in college, worked in the office of Michael Scott and Partners, coloring plans for the Busaras, the bus station, which was really the first significant modern building in Dublin. There was nothing before then at all, nothing at all. There was the addition to the library at Trinity College Dublin by an international competition in which my father was an assessor, chose the Polshek Partnership for that. That was a very modern building and very, very daring. When you look at Dublin today, it's astonishing to see buildings by Daniel Libeskind, bridges by Calatrava. I mean, it's just all the difference in the world. But this was a different era, and the Dublin Embassy was definitely cutting edge when it was built. And I think the very nice aspect of it is, for some reason or other, it doesn't shout modern architecture. It's difficult to categorize it. It's a building that Dubliners, and I include myself in that certainly, were very enthusiastic about. And I think that it made a very, very strong statement. And Dubliners have come to love that modern building, I think, perhaps more than any other contemporary building in Dublin.
Cormac?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to ask that question, because I agree with both comments by Norman and Christen, that the world has changed. The design of embassies and diplomatic buildings has totally changed. Like, this particular series is almost like pavilions for a world fair. Like, you're asking architects and architecture to inspire people to say, my country is better than yours. And what's really also interesting about the design of these buildings, particularly today, is that I equate them a lot to airports. And when airports arrived in the 20th century, you know, they were inspiring people about the power and capacity of air travel and the excitement of it. But then there was also the functional aspect of airports that you don't see when people come in, through entrances that you don't see, and has to operate. So these buildings now, I think the balance has skewed in the other way, in that they, understandably, but they actually have to function as, you know, a real office with security functions and limited access, and you have a very controlled experience curated in there. And it's less about walking into this, being able to wander into this atrium and just being inspired by the potential of America and deciding there and then to sign up on a visa. It just can't happen like that anymore. So I think that's kind of what changed, is that now we have more of an emphasis on the functional use of these buildings as opposed to the capacity to inspire.
So to look at it from the other perspective, for foreign embassies that have building in the United States, they have security issues, of course, but not the same kind of fortress mentality that we have. So what do you observe in these kinds of embassies here in the United States from other countries? Are they still using architecture as a way to promote the values of their country? Christen, you want to start?
Well, I don't have a lot to say about that, because I'm not aware of so many new embassies that have gone up from other countries. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I'm certainly aware of embassies up and down Massachusetts Avenue. What stands out to me is the German embassy, for instance, done, I believe, in the, would have been in the 60s if I was there. That was a striking building, Corten steel, very modern. Passed it every day on my way to school. The other embassies were usually housed in buildings that were much more part of the Beaux-Arts city fabric. So I'm not aware of how other countries are doing it. I'm more aware of how we're doing it, and fortress is the word.
Okay.
Making it as nice as possible, but fortress and function is the word.
Norman, you've shot a lot of embassies, both American and non-American.
Well, no, I haven't. A couple. But the contemporary embassy that I have shot, the Italian embassy in D.C., that is has a totally different philosophy than embassies that are currently being built. And it has a much more cultural component to it, and it's a much softer building. Piero Sartogo was the architect for that building, and I think it's an excellent building. If you get an opportunity in Washington, D.C. to go and visit it, I would recommend it, because that's the way I would like to see more embassies. But sadly, I think that we're not likely in the near-term future to see anything of the same ilk that the American embassy in Dublin was, and embassies elsewhere. It's just politically not feasible.
Cormac?
I think that's actually, you got to the nub of the issue there, Norman, in that, like, it's the fact that these were not just embassies, they were cultural centres. Like, people could walk in, read American periodicals. I know, for example, in the embassy in The Hague, the canteen only served American food, for example. So people would go there. And people have told me, an architect colleague of mine in the 80s went into the US Embassy to see the premiere of E.T. Coming to Dublin, and the Coca-Cola tasted different there. All these kind of stories you hear about how you were getting a taste of the American experience when it was effectively a cultural centre for the United States Information Service. So yeah, I think that's probably the big difference for me in that we don't make buildings like that really anymore. I think they happen in the context of world fairs, as I mentioned. But now an embassy is an embassy. Like I can't really speak about the American version because I wouldn't be as familiar with buildings in the States. But I know in Ireland, people often ask me, oh, what about the other embassies? Like, who else is doing it well and all that. And what's interesting is that most of them occupy Georgian houses, which in themselves are beautiful. And that's because most of them have the ambassador's quarters within the embassy. So it's kind of functional to adopt a house, and a stately house at that, if you're going to be sleeping upstairs. And this building was detached completely. The American ambassador's residence is in our Phoenix Park, and it's absolutely beautiful 18th century building. So they kind of had both, the America and Ireland, yeah.
If you get a chance to visit in Washington, D.C., the embassy for Finland, they have cultural events there all the time.
Yeah.
And
very good one.
And it's gorgeous. It is absolutely gorgeous. And you can see that security people are there, but they don't really look as serious as our security people. They're doing their job, but they're there to host you and make sure that you get a sense of Finland that you didn't have when you came in the front door. That kind of vibe is just really precious to see. So if you get a chance, they have really regular programming at that embassy. Christian, this project in the 60s, this doesn't look like an easy building to put together. And this was all hand drawing. There was no CAD, there was no AI. Was this slide rules and math? I mean, how did they do it?
Well, this was slide rules and math. This was done the old-fashioned hard way, and pencil and just working through it again. Even the advent of CAD, of being able to redraw very quickly, didn't exist. Those hand drawings they're one-off. And if it didn't work, start another one. It was a slow process, but I think the discovery that comes from a hand drawing is different than comes from working in a computer. I work on a computer. I also draw, and I think that's an important, be able to do both. But the craft of this building, the Dublin Embassy, is remarkable. It is a modern technology, reinforced precast concrete, but done, as you saw in Cormac's photographs, the craft of the formwork, making the positive form, making the negative form, then casting the positive, and then vibrating it, and then the tolerances again. The tolerance is down to probably a quarter of an
Incredible,
inch. 3
really.
millimeters is about a quarter of an inch, and there's no room for error. If you miss it, you've really missed it. And other buildings that we design now, we build some forgiveness into it. There's a little bit of slop there, and the fineness of the craftsmanship of this building is remarkable today as it was when it was conceived. And it is a bold design because it was approved, and the chance for failure was there. And I think that's frightening and inspiring at the same time.
Norman, when you go to shoot a project, do you like to do a lot of research in advance, or is it better to just show up and have the building speak to you?
That's a good question. If given an opportunity, yes, I would. I don't want to be surprised by something, unprepared for it. But on the other hand, I have come across certain subjects just perchance, say, visiting them, and been inspired by them and taken a picture just literally on the spot without planning it. When you do an assignment, however, most of my photography these days is just I shoot for fun.
Yeah.
I shoot because I want to shoot. I only get occasional assignments these days. I did have a nice one last year, and then I got to take some photographs of the very old apartment building across the street from Carnegie Hall. And that's going to appear in book form.
Was that the Rockefeller
later.
Apartments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yes. But I do want to mention one thing. The whole purpose of embassies has so completely changed. One of the occupants of the American Embassy in Dublin was the U.S. Information Agency, the USIA. That doesn't even exist today. For years, they were a client of mine. I would propose stories for them and photograph for them. They had a magazine. They produced a magazine that went to Russia, and it was a propaganda to illustrate what America was all about for a Russian audience. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. Cormac, a last question for you.
Yep.
What's the fate of this building now? What's going to happen to it when the U.S. State Department moves out? Who's lined up to want to love it and adopt it, or is it going to be demolished?
That's the million-dollar question. We don't know at this point. We do know that the embassy have announced plans to develop the site across the road from it and eventually relocate. But we're looking at it. We would assume that's a few years away, so there's a bit of time there. And what could happen between now and then, we don't know. I can say for sure that there is a huge group of architects and non-architects alike who really, really treasure this building and would do everything in their power to try and influence the decision against it being demolished. So that would be the worst case scenario as far as we're concerned. You can look at the other embassies of that period and maybe get an idea of what could happen, and sometimes it's really good. Like the Breurs Embassy in The Hague, as I mentioned, although it might be a temporary measure, is a brilliant, really, really interesting art gallery at the moment and artist studios, and encourage anyone to visit in The Hague. And then there are other versions which can happen for economic reasons, where the embassy in London, for example, Saarinen's embassy, has been vacated and it's now been converted into a very high-end hotel. So it's harder to get public access to it. And what I always say is, when we kind of speculate about what might happen when the embassy leaves, let's hope that we can get people back in the building. Let's get that security function out of there eventually, so that people can actually enjoy and appreciate John Johansen's architecture. And then also hopefully get the plaza back, that space back. The gift to Dublin, as he described it, would be remarkable. But it is definitely an uncertain time. Yeah.
Let's have a big round of applause for our panel. We have some time for a few questions from the audience. Does anyone want to ask our panel something? The question is, has the City of Dublin preemptively landmarked the building?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually, and it comes back to that complication that it's technically American soil. So, for example, the anecdote I gave is, if there's a fire in that building, the Dublin City Fire Brigade has to get permission from the US State Department to enter the premises. So it's quite complicated. But as part of the rezoning of land adjacent to this for the future embassy, a condition of that was that once it is no longer American territory, they wanted to protect it. So we know that the local authority, the kind of city, is very, very keen to see this building protected. So that's very encouraging.
All right, that's good news. Yeah,
absolutely.
The question is, does the embassy have some of the same structural issues with the precast concrete that exist at the Glasshouse pavilions now?
The short answer is no, or not the same, because I suppose the pavilion in the pond is in a body of water, which presents a challenge for concrete to begin with. And then also, I suppose it's a smaller scale, and from what I understand, Johnson was deliberately experimental with that pavilion, that it was a sort of precursor to a later project. In Dublin's case, it has the same issues you'll have of any building from that period. So yes, it does need care, it does need a restoration. There's single glazing, for example, which presents thermal issues. There's thermal breaks in the concrete. So I would say there are some challenges, but nothing out of the ordinary, and I would consider the pavilion to be out of the ordinary in the best possible way.
The question is about the idea of panopticon in the building and whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing.
Yeah, it's a good observation. And look, I think so much of how they described the embassy at the time was about storytelling and a narrative that people could get behind. So everyone likes to hear a building that turns its back on no one, in the inviting sense. I kind of say on the flip side that yes, there is a sort of, inference there that, someone is always looking at you. But I think genuinely the central space, whatever it might feel like to me individually, or as Shane described it, it is meant as a gathering kind of focus of the building in a very positive sense, that you could have events there, that someone might be looking at you, but they might be friendly. And I suppose the only thing I would temper that with is, I think it's quite telling to see John's drawing of the man lurking in the shadows, looking out in the centre. So maybe he was dropping us hints for sure, but certainly in the mainstream narrative, it is friendly and positive. Yeah.
Great. The question is about the selection of photography. Christen, you want to start?
I know my father was careful and wanted to have his work presented in the best way possible. That's why he called Norman. And it's evident in the photographs. I don't remember him poring over photographs and sort of being critical in that way. But I know that he was concerned. I saw, when I worked in his office, I saw many models coming in, and I think that's when I probably first met Norman, when he was setting up the lights and scrambling around a model there. And so I was aware of it, that was the aspect of architecture and in the expression and the appreciation and selling it. And that is part of the process, an important part.
Well, in answer to your question, did I feel that I had missed something? No, I didn't actually, although I must say that having seen Cormac's book now, I wish I had an opportunity to do an aerial or two, because the building does explain itself extremely well from the air. I think that's a fascinating aspect of it. And of course, drones weren't invented back then, so you couldn't have done the equivalent of that.
Well, they had hot air balloons, didn't they?
They did, but they're not terribly convenient for photographers. But in any event, I was visiting on a regular basis back to Dublin with my family. So I had ample opportunity to sort of plan to be around with plenty of time. So I could wait for, if the weather wasn't suitable, I could wait for it. And with a round building, it's terrific because there aren't any bad angles. It was really, from that standpoint, the exterior was a breeze. You could photograph it close in or far away, anything you want. And the site was completely open, far cry from what it still is today. When it came to the interiors, however, although the interior was well lit, it was somewhat contrasty. Also, the furniture wasn't great. They spent so much money on the building that they really didn't have much budget left over for really top-notch furniture. And I've always felt that the furniture in the interior could have done the building a lot more justice than it did. And so that I look at some of my photographs, and by comparison with things that I was doing here, I sort of cringe when I look at them. I said, that just doesn't look right. It just looks too spindly. It's just not up to the standard of the building itself. And that's a big problem when it comes to interiors. And then the other question was scale. Do you do it with people, without people? I did come across a 35 millimeter photograph, which I actually had time to scan it. It shows a huge crowd of people in the atrium at the time of the building's opening. And I've never printed it up. I just found the negative that's just recently.
It's for the sequel. So the question is, if the building comes up for sale in a few years, who buys it and what happens? I have two answers for you. I think one, which I've heard call-outs for, which I steadfastly agree with, is that it could be a home for the Irish Arts Council, because I think this is a building that does inspire when it's furnished and finished correctly. And as a kind of creative person, I can only imagine if you were based in this building, if you're kind of make a statement about our creative industry in Ireland, what better building to do it, and what better legacy than that of John Johansen to kind of carry through with someone who was just so creative in so many different outlets. So I love that idea. And then the other version that we hear a lot of, which also makes a lot of sense, is an Irish-American museum or centre. You know, there are versions of that in Dublin. There's a huge Irish-American diaspora. We get American tourists all the time. It would be nice to find a way to kind of continue that connection, continue some of the original furnishings of this building, and have people come and experience something akin to what you would have originally experienced when the building was open. Norman?
Yeah, I mean, I think the building would sort of lend itself to a museum type of structure. It's also, the circulation is particularly interesting in the building, in that you can go up to any level and
easily
look into it, and it's so that central atrium is really very special. And then you've got lots of space, the ring of offices around. It's a very efficient use of office space in that building. It's really very, very, it's a beautifully designed building. It's a
I'm reminded
masterpiece.
of the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C. a little bit.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Christen?
Well, I have a selfish thought. I think it would make an excellent school of architecture. And I think that I actually imagine all of us could see ourselves in studios ringing a central atrium where the critique space is there, where you're walking around the hallways looking in and out of studios. I think it would be a wonderful school of architecture. I think it would also be a great museum. But I'd love to go to school there if I had to do
Trinity
it all again.
College can finally get one. Thank you all for coming tonight. This has been fantastic. You can get copies of David's books about embassy, and also Norman's longevity supplements are for sale in the gift shop. Thank you. Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by the Brent R. Harris Charitable Trust, restorer of Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House in Palm Springs and 6 other houses in California. By the E. Fay Jones Conservancy, preserving the legacy of modernist architecture in Northwest Arkansas, efayjonesconservancy.org. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Visit USModernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 25,000 significant modernist houses, and access 5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Got a guest to suggest for the show? Write her at bobby@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.